Support for This News is So Gay comes from the LGBTQ Plus Opportunity Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, leveraging philanthropy to empower LGBTQ plus communities. Welcome to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck, editor of The Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ plus newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us. Here's what's coming up on this week's special episode, which this week is being supported by the Counter Narrative Project, a nonprofit that shifts narratives about Black, gay, and queer men to change policy and improve lives. A new report is out, the 6th annual State of HIV Stigma report. GLAAD, Gilead Sciences, and the Gilead COMPASS initiative have tracked Americans' knowledge and attitudes around HIV and HIV stigma, and we're going to talk all about that report on this week's episode, including what is the gap between advancements in HIV prevention and treatment and awareness in HIV prevention and treatment? How does the representation of people living with HIV in the media connect with stigma? What is the connection between HIV, criminalization, and stigma, and queer joy? Is there any queer joy to be found in any of this? Joining us this week to answer those questions and so many more, Senior Director of Local News for the U.S. South for GLAAD, the nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ plus advocacy and cultural change. Fresh back from NABJ, Darian Aaron. Darian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Ken, thanks for having me. It's so good to be back for the umpteenth time, it feels like. Yeah, so good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here and joining us for the first time in their podcast debut, Associate Director of Education and Advocacy at GLAAD and lead author of this report, Jarrell Hardnett. Jarrell, welcome to the podcast.
What's up, Ken? Such a pleasure to be here. And might I add, your voice is so soothing.
Tell a friend. Our LGBTQ plus reporters roundtable is now assembled, so let's dive in. Before we even dive into the report, let's start with our ever-present lay down on the couch opening question, where we find out how our roundtable is doing. Darian, how are you doing?
You know, I'm doing really great this week. Life is good personally and professionally. As you mentioned, I was at NABJ last week, and it was such an incredible experience being in a room filled with talented Black journalists from all over the country. I'm really looking forward to next year's convention in Houston. So overall, Ken, I cannot complain. Life is good.
Jarrell, how are you holding up?
Hey, Ken, I'm doing well. Just coming back from the Saving Ourselves Symposium here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I actually had the opportunity to present the State of HIV Stigma report. And it was filled with a room of executive leaders, advocates, who are really thirsty to hear the information and understanding where are these gaps at and how can we in our own individual selves as an organization or even share this outward with our leaders about what can we do to help mitigate these issues.
I am so excited to talk all about that. That gives us the perfect segue to jump right into the report. Jarrell, let's jump up to that flying altitude, that 42,000 foot level, so we can get some perspective. Tell our listeners why this report is important and how did it come together?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest takeaway is actually pretty simple. The science around HIV has moved forward tremendously, but the public understanding has not actually just kept pace. When we're actually looking at these numbers today, we have 31% of Gen Z adults who say they feel knowledgeable about HIV, and that's compared to actually the 60% of Generation X. What really brings it home for me right here is that the disconnect in this report really exposes that. We have incredible science, we have PrEP, we have the treatment that allows people to live with HIV to live long, healthy lives. And we know that someone who maintains an undetectable viral load cannot sexually transmit HIV, which is U equals U, which celebrates actually 10 years this year.
Yeah.
But science progress only changes lives when they actually know about it and have the access and actually believe it.
Yeah. Jarrell just mentioned it, Darian. We've talked so many times on this podcast about generational differences. I'm laughing because I'm thinking of our colleague, Sam Dondelinger, who learns all about these things at house parties in Brooklyn. And every time she says it, I feel 82 years old. It looks like those generational differences are pretty darn stark when it comes to HIV awareness.
Yeah, the generational divide is pretty stark. And I have to tell you, I hosted an intergenerational discussion with four generations of folks last week. We had baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z in one room discussing how HIV continues to impact Black Americans, specifically in the South. And one of the things that I remember so vividly, Malcolm, he's a 68-year-old Black man based here in Atlanta who's been living with HIV for over 30 years. And he said it was amazing to him that this current generation, Gen Z, they're not even discussing HIV. It's not even on their radar. And then I remember hearing from a 15-year-old in the room who said, I wouldn't know anything about HIV if it were not for my mom. Her mother is actually living with HIV and she's a HIV advocate, so she's public about her status. But if it were not for that, as a Gen Zer, she would not have the education necessary to keep herself safe. So we have a lot of work to do.
So much work to do. So obviously, media representation lives at the core of GLAAD's mission. That's what GLAAD does. And this report has so much information about media representation. So we have, on one hand, the amount of media representation of people living with HIV, but then we also have the quality of that representation. Let's start with that quantity, that amount first, Jarrell. It sounds like not really a ton.
Not nearly enough. And honestly, this is one of the findings that really stood out to me. And so when we look at the key numbers, 72% of Americans told us that they had not seen stories featuring real people living with HIV in media during the previous 12 months. And so why this actually matters for us here at GLAAD is that we're at the heart and minds of storytelling. That's what we do. For 40 years now, we've been doing this, telling this story, and it seems like we're not stopping today to continue to be champions for what this looks like. And so when we see people disappear from the education of what's happening around HIV and not the stories, then people's understanding about it and misinformation starts to build up. And that's what we're doing day in and day out to make sure that we can dismantle that and make sure that we're telling stories and holding people accountable for sharing these stories of people who are living these lives day in and day out.
So that's the number, and it obviously could be much higher in terms of representation. But then we have the actual representation that is being seen in the media. Darian, it sounds like the quality of that representation, not great. I'm reading the words outdated and inaccurate.
Those descriptors are accurate, outdated, and inaccurate. It's funny because Jarell and I were having this conversation earlier today about how LGBTQ characters and people living with HIV are dwindling in terms of being on TV and in film. Like they have just completely disappeared. I came of
Yeah.
age during the 90s when we had films like Philadelphia
Yeah.
and the band played on, even Boys in the Band, which was released before the 90s. It's kind of a classic, a cult classic at this point, because it has aged. But then we had the remake a few years ago on Netflix. So we had media representation of people living with HIV. Granted, those stories were rooted in trauma. And I think that's something that we should steer away from now in the year 2026, because we know because of the advancement of science that people with HIV are living long, healthy lives. And I think that goes back to the piece of Gen Z not being aware of HIV and how it's transmitted because they're not getting the same level of education that we receive through media. So it is a huge problem.
I just even remember watching Oprah. I mean, most of my childhood was watching Oprah. And so there's that. And just some of the, even the episodes that Oprah used to do on HIV, on living with AIDS, and how formative that was for me. And the idea that that's not part of the discourse is just not helping, making things even worse. We got federal funding cuts. Jarrell, let's talk about that funding piece. How are funding cuts affecting prevention and treatment?
Yeah, so the concern is that we're creating this really dangerous collision. On one side, our report shows that people need more education and more access to accurate HIV information. And on the other side, we're seeing threats and cuts to that very infrastructure that provides prevention, testing, treatment, research, and most importantly for me, is community education.
Mm.
So the report really tells us that 77% of Americans agree that stigma can discourage people from getting tested. And then another percentage that 73 agree stigma can discourage people from seeking treatment. And so when we combine stigma with fewer resources, fewer trusted messages, and disruption to prevention and treatment services, you're making an already difficult situation much harder. So we want to be sure that we can dramatically change this course of HIV. The question is whether we're going to make sure people can actually access these tools. And so, just really speaking right here from the heart, when we are thinking about this and the federal cuts that are happening, this is happening to the core CBOs, community based organizations, and ASOs, aid service organizations. And so I want people to be mindful as we're rolling back these opportunities. This is what's widening the gap for our Generation Z. They are now leaning into language model systems to learn about HIV instead of having a peer to peer conversation. And that's where the discourse is going to start happening. One thing I like to share is that someone for myself, I've been living with HIV for 10 plus years. And so it's interesting because my niece was actually going off to college this week. Her understanding of me living with HIV, she went to ChatGPT to understand what does this look like, but she didn't understand how to actually type in the words to educate herself. So she's from a space of, Uncle, should you not be transitioning? Should you not be sick? And I'm thinking, well, I'm the healthiest that I've ever been in my life. But you wouldn't know that because we have not had a conversation. That's when we're not having conversations with our families anymore. We're now allowing AI to educate and fuel our understanding. And that's why we need these monies to not only do peer to peer education, but just to get into the community to have these conversations with families, with barbers, with church leaders. We have to have these conversations.
And she's going off to college, and her uncle is only 4 years older than her, so there shouldn't be this generational gap. Darian, let's
Yes.
talk. I'm here to help. It's his first time on a podcast, folks. This is how we make people feel welcome. Darren, we have to talk about HIV decriminalization. This is a topic that I try to write about at each and every opportunity, particularly here in a state, here in Ohio. We have 6 laws on the books that criminalize living with HIV to a degree that is just staggering. And by the way, talking about gaps of knowledge, most people do not know about those 6 laws. So we're trying to do as much as we can at the Buckeye Flame to write about them. How does HIV criminalization play into this report?
And I actually did a lot of work around HIV criminalization, decriminalization during my time at CMP, which is a sponsor of this episode. It's something that they are really proactive about changing, not only in Georgia, but across the country. So, Ken, living with HIV should not be considered a crime, but in at least 32 states, people living with HIV can be prosecuted based on their HIV status. Failure to disclose an HIV diagnosis before sex, regardless, and this is key, this is what folks should know, regardless of actual transmission risk, can result in criminal prosecution, incarceration, and even placement on the sex offender registry. HIV criminalization laws do not consider the scientific advancements of antiretroviral drugs that have successfully suppressed the virus, allowing people living with HIV to achieve undetectable status. It all goes right back to U equals U. Undetectable equals untransmittable. So I have to tell you that last year I interviewed Robert Settle. He's a highly sought after consultant and thought leader. He was convicted under Louisiana's HIV criminalization statute in 2010 after a consensual sexual encounter led to a sentence and a 6-month incarceration. Ruling with an additional life altering requirement of registering as a sex offender under Louisiana law. And one of the things that Robert told me during our interview, and the story is posted on glad.org if anybody's interested in reading it, he shared with me that he believes that HIV criminalization laws are rooted in a false assumption that people living with HIV are intentionally wanting to transmit the virus to other people. So it goes back to the stigma piece. And a lot of these laws were proposed and passed into law at the height of the HIV epidemic when there was all this AIDS hysteria. But that's not where we are today. And so the laws do not match where we have advanced as a culture and in terms of scientific advancement.
If I can add a story to everyone's reading list, the piece that we did at the Buckeye Flame on Kamir Weaver, a 22-year-old Black trans male who it's not even just about that HIV wasn't transmitted. HIV couldn't have been transmitted under the law that they were imprisoned for. A year in prison for HIV. It wasn't that they didn't transmit. Of course they didn't. They couldn't. That sexual act cannot transmit HIV. And yet that's a year of their life in prison. So I am going to keep talking about this topic as many times as we can. For right this second, you all are listening to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck from the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ plus newsroom. Joining me this week, Darian Aaron and Jarrell Hartnett from GLAAD. Please leave a review for This News is So Gay wherever you leave reviews and get your podcasts. One listener just left this review. This News is So Gay excels by being entertainingly informative and providing connections across our modern American landscape. Say something like that. It really helps us out. If you are not subscribed to This News is So Gay, what on earth are you waiting for? Subscribe to This News is So Gay right this very second on your favorite podcasting app so that new episodes automatically make their way to you. Well, it is time, folks. It is time for Glitter Bomb. This is where our roundtables share stories of queer joy that they are seeing covered there in the news. And what I'm hoping for this week, I'm not skipping the Glitter Bomb because we're talking about a specific report. I'm hoping that there is queer joy to be found in this report, or maybe HIV prevention treatment work that we're seeing out there. So let's try to set off a Glitter Bomb. Jarella, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to supply you with one glitter bomb before you even supply your own. There's the part where you were the lead author on the report that is completed and in people's hands, and that's queer joy in itself. And I hope that you did. Yes, this is not the happiest information, but it's to be celebrated that there is more information out there. So I am providing that glitter bomb. What would you like to add to the mix?
For me, the joy is the fact that people living with HIV are living full and beautiful lives. We get so focused on stigma, statistics, and disparities, and sometimes we forget to talk about the actual life of people. There are people living with HIV who are thriving, loving, dating, getting married, having families, and growing older. And growing older with HIV itself sometimes worth celebrating when you think about the history of this epidemic. I also find joy in younger generations being willing to ask the actual questions that need
Mm,
to be had. The knowledge gap we found among Generation Z concerns me, absolutely, but also gives us an opportunity. We can meet young people where they are, particularly online, give them accurate information without actually shame. To me, queer joy is also refusing to allow HIV to be synonymous with tragedy. There is so much to life on the other side in the outdated narratives. And for me, living with this for 10 plus years today, still undetectable, I'm still thriving and living my life day in and day out.
I love that. Gosh, I would not want to follow that. Darian, follow that. Give us some queer joy.
I will do my best. That was beautiful. I'm so proud of my colleague. I
I
mean, he
love
did
Thank you,
such a
Darian.
this.
fantastic job authoring this report. And to see him, pop his cherry on his first podcast, and I'm here to witness that, it's just beautiful. So let me try to follow that up. At GLAD, we're really focused on tapping into content creators because that's where young folks are really getting their information. That's where they're getting their news right now. And there are three content creators who create this amazing content around HIV. And they were actually a part of our creators event that we had a couple of weeks ago. And they're now starting to disseminate information about the HIV stigma report. O'Calley is one, Trey Melvin is another, and there's one gentleman whose name escapes me right now, but he's huge on TikTok. He's based in North Carolina, and I hope to do some work with him soon. But just the fact that these brave young men are out in the world sharing their HIV status and educating a populace that is really uninformed about HIV and how it's transmitted and how you can protect yourself from the virus. I just give them so much credit. They just have all the respect in the world from me because they are doing the heavy lifting. They are taking the information right to the people who need it the most. So I'm really proud to be in community with those folks.
Love it. Well, normally we close out the show by asking what our roundtable is working on. But what I want to talk about is what do we do with this report? So we have this information. There's a lot to digest here. We really want folks to read through it, not just the executive summary, my friends, but all the different data points and all the different pieces of information that are being presented here. But what do we actually do with this report? Jarrell, what do we do with this information?
You're going to use the damn thing. That's what you're going to do because you're not going to simply take this information, download it, and allow it to just sit on your desk. That's foolish. You're not doing anything with it. You're not supporting, you're not amplifying, you're not supporting the bottom base of it. So I have three audiences that I want to speak to specifically for today. For the media, outside of what you're doing right now, Ken, where you're putting us on your platform to talk about this, for others in media to tell more stories about HIV and tell better stories. For public health leaders and advocates, we have to rethink how we're reaching people, especially younger people and communities where knowledge gaps remain. And finally, policymakers. Our policies need to reflect the science in 2026, not the fear and the misinformation that still stems from 1980s.
Gosh, I would not want to follow that. Darian, what do we do with this report? I'm just going to keep setting you up like this because it
Yeah,
entertains
Ken,
me.
you keep setting me up for failure, but I don't fail. No, we're not doing that today. Okay, so this is what I have to add to the conversation. I think we all have a part to play when it comes to eradicating stigma. I often say that stigma is more deadly than the disease itself in 2026. And what does that look like? Let me give you a quick example. On TikTok, if you do hashtag HIV, hashtag Atlanta, it will take you down a rabbit hole of some of the worst misinformation you will ever see and hear in your life. One particular video that went viral, a creator said that 1 million people in the city of Atlanta was living with HIV. So beware, protect yourself. There's not even 1 million people in the city of Atlanta. I think it's a little over 500,000. So that was inaccurate, but people latched onto that and it went viral. That's just how quickly misinformation can spread. So if you know better, do better. Take the findings from this report, share it with a friend, and I echo Jarrell. Reporters have to do a better job of telling HIV stories and incorporating it into their beat. You don't have to wait until World AIDS Day to tell this story.
Well, I'd like to introduce a new segment to the show. This is where a veteran panelist grades a newbie's performance on their first podcast. Darian, how did Jarrell do?
Oh, Ken. I mean, you've just been trying to get me in trouble the entire podcast. What is that about? I give my brother an A minus because there's always room for improvement.
There it is, holding him to a high standard. The sixth annual State of HIV Stigma report is out. We will link to it. It's super easy to find. Jarrell Hardnett, Darian Aaron, thank you for doing the work and talking about it and translating it, right? That's the biggest piece for me is it's not just words that are on a page, but let's take those words, let's start conversations, and let's change some lives. Thank you both for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
I'm Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame, and if you liked this episode of This News is So Gay, please share it with a friend. Subscribe so that you do not miss out on our next episode. Send an email on over to editor@thebuckeyeflame.com. That's me, to let us know your thoughts, and rate and review us on your favorite podcasting app. This News is So Gay is a product of the Buckeye Flame, a nonprofit newsroom. Become a recurring donor today for as little as $12.50 a month, which truly enables programming like This News is So Gay from a scrappy queer nonprofit newsroom like the Buckeye Flame. In the meantime, read LGBTQ+ news, share the stories penned by LGBTQ+ reporters, and support the work of LGBTQ+ newsrooms. Until next week, friends.